John Barnes, it's an absolute pleasure to speak to you. If we start off, since your playing days, it appears as though racist abuse from fans towards players has become a lot less prominent, despite it flaring up from time to time. What do you think are the key factors in this?
Well, of course, it's only because of the punishments. But that doesn't mean racism wasn't there. They just kept their mouth shut. Racism is always there. As long as it exists in society, it will exist in all walks of society. So it didn't disappear in football. They were just more vigilant to make sure that they didn't get caught because they knew they'd be ejected if they had any racist chanting. Now, we can see in the last 2 or 3 years that it's got worse. So if it disappeared, why is it now getting worse? It has never gone away. It's just that people then felt emboldened to then start to abuse players again. Because, of course, there are many different reasons for that. I'm not going to start getting into politics and Brexit and blaming the foreigner. But, of course, then to hate the foreigner became very apparent in the last 2 or 3 years, to blame the foreigner for everything. And we can see a lot of the rhetoric that was used for people who didn't look like they were from England. So, of course, I suppose that's why football, just like in society, it started to rear its ugly head again. But we never got rid of it. It's impossible to get rid of in football until we get rid of it in society.
You touched on society there. In the past 5 years, we've seen hate crime figures skyrocket. So what do you think has contributed to this?
Racism isn't on the increase. It always was there. Of course, what's being reported is being on the increase. And as I said, I think the last 2 or 3 years in terms of the political climate of the country has emboldened people to then be more brazen and the rise of the far right to then actually do it. Whereas it was always there. It was always there, but people just kept their mouth shut. So you can see as what's happening with society as a whole, and look what's happening in America, whereby all of a sudden, we are blaming immigrants and immigration, and of course England seems to be going down that path as well. So we've got a big problem. We have a huge problem. But as I said, we have to start tackling it in society rather than look to individual institutions and saying, well, the world is okay, but it's football, or it's the police, or it's something else, or it's film. So that's the situation.
You've been campaigning against racism for over 30 years now. What have you found to be the most effective ways of doing this?
Honesty. But of course, we can't afford to be honest, because we all wait for a football fan to get caught, and then we come down hard on him and say, here's the problem. We don't look at ourselves and say, do we really believe in equality? Do we really believe that everybody, from a color perspective, is equal? And the answer is no. But I don't blame society, because this is what society has been shown for the last 200 years, that there are a group of people who are superior to others, intellectually and morally, and we know who they are. So if you've been showed that for the last 200 years, how can things change just for the fact that we're now getting to a situation whereby we're saying, well, we're all equal, without actually deconstructing why we think some people are superior. So when I say deconstructing, we have to go back to understand what caused racism in the first place before we can get rid of racism. We can't say, forget what happened in the past. Forget the narrative from historians, geneticists, anthropologists, and the most brightest minds in the world who said that white people were superior, and that has been going on for 200 years. And that has been in society for 200 years by the brightest people. The people who started racism weren't stupid, ignorant people. They were the brightest people in the world. The anthropologists, the geneticists. And if they thought and they influenced society to believe that, do we think we can now change that just by in the last 10, 20 years by going, everything we have learned, we have seen, is wrong. Why is it wrong? Oh, because we're all created equal. We have to deconstruct the lies that we're told about. And once again, when I talk about discrimination, I don't just talk about it from a race point of view. What have we been told about women? What have we been told about homosexuals, about gay people, about transsexuals? So what we have been wrongly told about different groups of people have made us come to the perception about women's ability to fight in the war, a black man's ability to lead, a gay person's ability to fight or to be a real man. These are lies we have been told about them, and we have to deconstruct those lies. And it's a very complex and nuanced and difficult thing to do. But all we're doing is thinking if you can pass laws to say to people, you must not discriminate, that'll get rid of discrimination. That won't.
At Show Racism the Red Card, we've just released our new film challenging racism towards our NHS workers, which highlights racist abuse and institutional racism suffered by NHS staff. What would you say to any NHS workers that are on the receiving end of racist abuse?
Well, first of all, when you talk about how BAME people have disproportionately been affected by it, that's because they are the ones, not just on the front line, but they're the ones in the disadvantaged areas. When you're talking about living in close proximity to each other in the inner cities of a city, where they're mainly, BAME people, of course they're going to be, I don't think it's anything necessarily genetic why BAME people are getting it. It's to do with their circumstance and their environment. So once again, their environment, as always happened throughout history, the poorest and the most disadvantaged has suffered in times of war, in times of disease, in times of famine. So that is an example. It is not a racist disease whereby it is targeting black people. It's because of the environment they're actually in, which is why they get it. Now, what can we do? It's okay when we give advice to the people who are suffering from racism or getting racist abuse. What advice are we giving to the people who are actually doing it? And no one's talking about that. We're always talking about, if you suffer racism, what do you do? We have to target the ones who are actually doing it and say, how are we going to change their perspective and change their minds rather than putting them in prison or banning them from football? So, of course, everybody has to deal with it in their own way. But I can't give a nurse advice that you're going to get racist abuse. What am I going to say to her? Don't treat them, punch them in the face, ignore it. We have to look at the people who are actually doing it and start to challenge them.
And what would you say to those people?
Why do you feel that you're superior? And you know what they'll say? Because they see it every day in the newspaper. They see it every day when they read headlines of Yardi Jamaican drug dealers, of Muslim grooming gangs, and of something negative to do with communists. So they can't help it. This is the way they have been conditioned to think. And if they knew that, maybe they would think differently. Maybe they think differently. So if you say to them, why do you feel that you are superior? You know what they'll tell you? History shows me that. Because we won the war. Yeah? No one else got involved. The British people won the war. White people won the war. We are the champions of the NHS, as you can see. And this is where it's actually changed. Because in the first 2 weeks, the NHS looked very white. And I tweeted about this. And people said, oh, why are you bringing race into it? Now, if you look at it now, you can see the real value and the real geopolitical situation of how many BAME people are in the NHS and how many black doctors. And whereas before, our heroes were always white, just like in history and just like we have seen throughout. So I understand it is understandable for people to be racist. I say this all the time because of what they have been wrongly told. So I'm not saying, but because they're afraid to admit it, and that's what I talk about honesty, because if you then say, I am racially biased, people are going to say, you lose your job, you go to prison, you're never going to be able to work again. Whereas if we say to them, why you're racially biased? Because of what you have been wrongly told about groups of people, and we come together to try and change their minds about being racist and why they are racist, that's the only way to do it. Because what will happen is if you just keep punishing the innocent ones who get caught, the real ones will keep their mouth shut. I am not saying Piers Morgan is a racist. However, when Piers Morgan on television goes ching, 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 chong about the Chinese man, because Piers Morgan is a powerful man, nothing happens to him. If anybody else did that, or if somebody did that with an African and mocked an African accent, they would lose their job. So these are the problems we're having.
The film also touches on institutional racism and why it's harder for black and minority ethnic workers to progress within the NHS. So what do you think are the key barriers to tackling institutional racism?
Well, we talk about institutional racism in the NHS where BAME people can't get on. In football, how many football managers? In the police, how can they get on? In the city, how do they get on? Once again, this is not institutional racism in any particular institution. It is a part of society. And the more we then, first it was football, institutional racism. Now then it was the police. Now it's the NHS. Now it's going to be in the city. It's everywhere. So we have to stop looking at it individually and saying that it's a problem in the NHS. Because what will happen is the rest of society will absolve itself of responsibility to look at it holistically by just saying, it's not a problem with us. It's just a problem with the NHS. Oh yeah, it's a problem with football as well. Oh yeah, it's a problem with the police as well. Oh, it's a problem with business as well. Where are we going to stop? How many BAME people are in the high echelons of any industry? So the institution that is racially biased is the institution of Western society and English society, not any individual institution. And until we start to tackle it in that way, we will never stop anything, because what will happen is that all of a sudden, yes, you may have a black CEO of the NHS. So does that now prove that they're not institutionally racist anymore because you have got someone who's now leading the NHS? That's not the case. You have to change everybody's perception.
We've also seen a rise in Islamophobia in recent times. What do you think is the cause of this?
Well, we look at the rise of Islamophobia, and that's obvious because of what's happened in the last 10, 15 years. And that has continued. And of course, when black people went through it for a long time, Muslims now seem to be getting it because of the representation, the narrative, the perception we have of them, which doesn't help by the media. I'll give a perfect example. When you had Jihadi John, who did what he did, and there was that white terrorist in New Zealand the Australian who went to New Zealand, killed those Muslims. And in the newspaper, it had a nice picture of a beautiful blonde boy, and it said, blonde hair, blue-eyed boy turns into killer. And when I made this point to somebody on the radio, on LBC, that this doesn't help because it presupposes that because you got blonde hair and blue eye, you shouldn't be a killer. And I made the point. He then said to me, I won't tell you who it is, but it was on LBC. He said to me, no, but I don't agree with you, because when you had Jihadi John, they had a picture of Jihadi John, and it said, Jihadi John, good at school, captain of the football team, was a good boy at school, member of the community, turns into killer. And I made the point to him, which people don't understand. When you look at the characteristics on Jihadi John, when it said good at school football team, worked hard, worked in the community, which are attributes contributed to goodness, all of those, worked hard, school football team, community member, their attributes contributed to goodness. So when he turns into a killer, it's a surprise. So when they said about Jihadi John, but what attributes contributed to goodness is blonde hair and blue eye. That's all it said. It never said he was a good boy. All it said was blonde hair and blue eye. So when we see that, how can we help but assume and be conditioned to then think, yes, how can a blonde hair, blue eyed person be a killer? Whereas, of course, if you're a Muslim or if you're black, you can be a killer. And this is how we become conditioned every single day of our lives. Another instance in America where the blonde woman phoned the police, and because she thought someone was breaking into her house, the police went round to the back of her alley where she lived to look. She came out. It was a big case in America. She came out. It's in the dark, and she knocked on the policeman's door in the back alley when it was dark, and the police shot her and killed her. And the lawyer who was prosecuting the policeman said to him, what was threatening about blonde hair and a pink t-shirt? Because that's what she was wearing. What was threatening about, whereas if he was black with a black t-shirt, that would be threatening. And this is how we are conditioned. Now, interestingly, it's not just about race, because the most interesting thing for me about that statement, blonde hair and a pink t-shirt, is the pink t-shirt. Because what they're actually saying is that even if it was a man, the fact that he had a pink t-shirt on, why would that be threatening? Because surely he must be gay if he's wearing a pink t-shirt rather than a black t-shirt. So it shows the conditioning we have to the color pink, which then, if you're a man wearing pink, not so much these days, but in the old days, could talk about being gay. So even the conditioning we have, not just in terms of race, but in terms of sexuality and in terms of sex, whether you're a man or a woman. So that's why I say it is completely understandable when people are racist, sexist, and homophobic because of what we have been told. And that's what we have to challenge. Challenge the narrative for years and years about what it means to be black, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be gay, and turn that around.
The anti-racism movement constantly needs to assess, are we making progress? So at this time, do you think we are making progress?
The problem you have is that the anti-racism movement, like Show Racism the Red Card and Kick It Out and these others, are focusing mainly on football. And what happens when you focus on football is that society doesn't look at itself because it says it's a football problem. Now, I know Show Racism the Red Card does more than that in terms of schools, but the majority of people think Show Racism the Red Card is just a football situation whereby they're looking at it in football. So no one else thinks about that. And that is the biggest problem. The fact that the majority of the anti-racist programs is all to do with football. But of course, now what's going to happen is to do with film and singers wanting to get Oscars and black managers and whereas I'm talking about we have to tackle it in the inner cities, in society as a whole. So if you're asking me, they're making progress. Are they making progress? Are things getting any better? You can see overt racism has now reappeared, but in terms of the reality of whereby you can actually look and see a tangible difference in terms of average people's lives getting better in the NHS, in the police, in all walks of life, it's not. So therefore, Show Racism the Red Card and other of these anti-discriminatory, anti-racism situations can only do so much. They can only do so much. They can't change society. We have to change society.
John Barnes, thank you very much.